In early 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte reclaimed his throne in France with a brilliant campaign for Paris. After this, he introduced extensive political reform and rebuilt the French army from the ground up. He was going to need it, for almost 1 million men would be mobilized to remove him from the country. Again. Wellington's 100,000-strong Army of Flanders and Blücher's 150,000-strong Prussian army of the Lower Rhine concentrated in Belgium, while other forces surrounded the French frontier. Napoleon's Army of the North had only 130,000 men to oppose this. Napoleon wasn't entirely alone at first. The flamboyant Joachim Murat, one of his most famed cavalry commanders, brought the Kingdom of Naples against the Seventh Coalition. He diverted attention away from France by invading the papacy and Tuscany. However, Murat would defeat the Austrians only once at the Battle of Pianoro. Throughout April and May, the Austrians, under Baron Fremont and Frederick Bianchi, counterattacked and decisively defeated Murat's Neapolitans at the Battle of Tallentino. Murat fled to Corsica and then southern France. The war ended before Napoleon's campaign even began. Napoleon understood that to stand any chance against the coalition, he must defeat the two armies in Belgium separately. He would certainly have that opportunity. Wellington and Blücher had no wishes to join in advance until the other armies arrived, allowing the coalition to invade with overwhelming numbers. Napoleon planned to march on Brussels, the regional capital. After taking it, he would decisively defeat the two armies in detail by putting his forces between them and away from each other. Napoleon, who hid his concentration of forces behind the frontier fortresses, moved his army by columns on June 15th. The left column consisted of 1st and 2nd Corps, his center 3rd and 4th Corps, with the cavalry reserves. The right column was just Lobau's 6th Corps. The right and center would be tasked with capturing Charleroi. Comte Charles Rey's 2nd Corps led the way to capture Gosselies, just north of Charleroi. Along the way, he encountered Prussian pickets at the villages of Thuin and then Marchiennes-au-Pont. The right wing at Philippeville made less steady progress. Difficult terrain made progress slow at first, but eventually 3rd, 6th, and the Reserve Cavalry Corps would reach the bridge over the Sambre toward Charleroi and engage Prussian skirmishers there as Comte Rey did at Thuin. As the Emperor joined his forces at Charleroi, so did Michel Ney, whom Napoleon regarded as the bravest of the brave for his actions in Russia. He gave Ney command of the left wing, wishing to reanimate their progress on Gosselies. It took precious time to dislodge the fortified Prussians, but French troops occupied the town by day's end. Ney ordered the Imperial Guard light cavalry that he took with him to follow the enemy to Fresnes, where they encountered stiff resistance from Nassau infantry and artillery. The Allies were pursued to the crossroads at Quatre, which held the roads to other Allied divisions at Namur and Nivelles, as well as the capital of Brussels. Unable to drive the coalition troops out of the crossroads, Ney consolidated his forces for the night. The Marshal had little knowledge of his Emperor's plans when he rode off to Cambrai. So as his men rested, he tried to learn as much as possible about the grand intentions of both sides. Though one thing was clear: keep Wellington away from the Prussians. When the light cavalry returned, he sent word to the Emperor that enemy troops defended the crossroads at the hamlet of Quatre. If Ney could hold it, he would block the Allies from reinforcing Blücher. Rey's 3 divisions, still miles away from Fresnes, will continue the fighting next day. The troops that the French cavalry attacked were part of Bernard of Saxe-Weimar's brigade. After he fought a disciplined withdrawal, Other Dutch forces at Charleroi confirmed the presence of the French marching from both directions. Bernard messaged his division commander, Baron Perponcher Sedlnitsky, and informed him of the action. Sedlnitsky then ordered Bernard to hold Quatre and promised him reinforcements. Bernard had no plans to leave either way. Letters from Sedlnitsky were hurriedly dispatched to Baron Constant Rebec, the Prince of Orange's chief of staff, to alert the prince, currently en route to dine with Wellington in Brussels. Rebec also penned the other two division commanders of the 1st Corps to assemble their forces near Haines-Saint-Pierre. Rebec tirelessly penned piles of reports of enemy movement to the capital. However, the French offensive was first met with apathy. At the ball, hosted by the Duchess of Richmond, rumors of attacks along the frontier were repeated and spread among civilian attendants. When inquired, military officers did not know enough about the situation to confirm their validity. That is, until Prussian officer Friar von Muffling confirmed that French troops were on the march. The rumors were confirmed, but Wellington, not wishing to spoil the ball, kept an almost calm and oblivious front, despite the danger. But in private, he famously declared, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. He has gained 24 hours' march on me." The ball continued until supper, where the full details of a letter from Constant Rebec were finally explained to the Duke. Napoleon had taken Charleroi, just 13 miles from Brussels. Word was spread discreetly to the officers, who bid farewell to their comrades and dance partners. For many, it would be their last night alive. The Prince of Orange returned to Braine-le-Comte and ordered his troops at Nivelles to march. Sedlnitsky arrived with 2 regiments from the 2nd Division before dusk. At 4 a.m., the Allied divisions in and around Brussels marched out, pipes and drums playing. Napoleon spent the night at Charleroi, instructing Marshal Soult to relay orders for the right wing and Imperial Guard to move and attack any enemy moving toward his position. Ney was to concentrate his corps, capture Quatre, and move on Brussels until Napoleon could support him. He further augmented Ney's forces by sending François-Étienne de Kellermann's 3,000 cavalry to Quatre. Believing he had no time to wait on the 1st Corps, Ney ordered an advance on the crossroads, screening their inferior numbers. Wellington had arrived there that morning, affirming that the Dutch should only have to block the way against a smaller French advance. Hearing that Blücher had encountered the main army under Napoleon, he rode off to meet with the elderly general at 10 a.m. The 1st battalions of both the Nassau-Usingen and Orange-Nassau regiments were marching to a new position next to the woods on the right when French cannon fire erupted. It was just before 2 p.m. that the Battle of Quatre began. Campire's 2nd Cavalry Division took the Jaegers by surprise and drove them. The regiment's colonel was killed in the charge. Next, a horde of tirailleurs, light infantry, swarmed in front of Pierrefonds in the Bossu woods. Pierremont's defenders could not stand the onslaught of Jamin's brigade. Sedlnitsky reacted, ordering the newly arrived 7th Militia between the Bossu and Charleroi road, as well as the 5th Militia on the right of Gemiancourt, with the flank companies extended to meet the enemy. The clouds of tirailleurs and the French artillery, now loaded with canister, were given many targets, but the 5th, with only 20 of its 450 soldiers being combat veterans, both gave and received great punishment. When the French unleashed the chasseurs and lancers of Campire's division, the rattled young militiamen barely responded in time. After we had formed square, we noticed that some men from one company or platoon were mixed of those of other companies, and wanted to restore proper order. Then Lieutenant Colonel Westenberg told us we did not have to be so precise, wrote one soldier. The French cavalry attempted to break the militia 4 consecutive times, but none were successful. Eventually, the unending fire from skirmishers and artillery compelled the 5th to fall back. Lieutenant Colonel Jean Westenberg encouraged the men to keep steady, but it was the intervention of Orange himself that reanimated the men. Waving his hat in the air, he called to them and led them forward personally. The 5th was a glimmer of hope on the battlefield, as the Allied artillery was driven back toward Quatre. Prince Bernhard kept his position in the Bossou Woods, further reinforced by the 7th Militia and the Nassau-Usingen Regiment. Casualties piled, but the line held firm against the onslaught. French skirmishers, having occupied Gemiancourt, screened the deployment of the rest of the 5th Division, advancing in columns toward Quatre. The advance, led by the 5th Lancers and 6th Chasseurs à Cheval, collided directly with the 5th Militia. This time, disorder prevailed, and they routed. The Prince of Orange himself was nearly captured, but found safety within the 7th Belgian Line Battalion, giving them the Star of the Order of William from his chest. My brave Belgians, take it. You have won it fairly. You have deserved it. The attack of Bachelou's division on Pierremont was so swift that Wellington was nearly captured as his staff returned to the battlefield. At this critical moment, Wellington brought with him the infantry of Thomas Picton's 5th Division. He immediately dispatched a battalion of the 95th Foot, the 95th Rifles, to the north of Pierremont to prevent a breakthrough. The green-jacketed infantry, armed with accurate Baker rifles, did just that. It was around 3 p.m. when Jérôme Bonaparte's 6th Division began arriving on the field, bringing Ney's forces to 24,500 men. Also at the same time, Allied cavalry from Jean-Baptiste von Merlin's Light Cavalry Brigade had arrived. Merlin, trying to stem the tide, hastily charged forward his 6th Dutch Hussars against the 6th Chasseurs à Cheval, but without sufficient time to deploy, they were slaughtered. When the 5th Belgian Light Dragoons met their French opponents, officers on both sides recognized each other. Some of the Allied officers, especially Dutch ones, previously served under Napoleon. "To us, Belgians, to us!" pleaded French officers. But the ensuing melee was made, and ended with the same results. The French cavalry counterattacked, overrunning the guns of 2 batteries and sabering the crews, before finally being checked by fire from the 92nd Islanders, directed by Wellington himself. The situation was nonetheless perilous. In just an hour, 2nd Corps had almost overrun the line at several points, and were still advancing in all directions. Ney had received word from Napoleon to defeat the enemy in front and join him to envelop the Prussians, and so hastened his attack. In the Bossou Woods, French tirailleurs outflanked Bernhard's brigade, forcing them back a distance. His exhausted Jaegers used up all of their ammunition, so he requested reinforcements. Luckily, after Picton's men were directed into line, the first elements of the Brunswick Corps arrived just in time. Grey and black-clad Brunswickers took position near the woods, while the Duke of Brunswick himself led cavalry near a British battery along the Namur Road, calmly smoking his pipe as bullets and shells flew overhead. With the line reinforced, Picton personally led his division in a counterattack on the French columns, advancing between Gemiancourt and Pierremont. Men from the 5th Militia and 27th Jaegers rallied and joined them on the right. Under the unbearable heat, the men advanced in disorder through the fields. The crops were so tall that they couldn't see the enemy, and when they appeared to the French, they were instantly rattled with musketry. Picton halted, and, dressed in his civilian attire, ordered his men to fire and charge. The 2nd Light Infantry of Housson's brigade was shaken momentarily, but gave a galling fire in return. Viré's cavalry once again charged the enemy, this time on their left flank. But despite horrifying losses, the British formed square and held off the charge. Nonetheless, the French infantry and artillery fire proved devastating. Even Picton was hit by spent cannonball, and despite that, the Welshman refused to leave his troops. It was only with the timely arrival of Captain Andreas Cleve's battery that cannonballs were returned to the French. Along with Retberg's Hanoverian battery, Cleve's gunners checked some of the French guns near Pierremont. As elements of Brunswick's corps continued to trickle in, Soubiere's brigade arrived, consisting of the 1st Light Infantry. Marshal Ney personally led its 3 battalions against the Brunswickers on the Allied right, overpowering them and taking that ground once again. Brunswick's losses were piling up, but they held their ground for a moment until the 3rd Line Regiment came upon them. The Duke, seeing this advance, personally led his Uhlans in a desperate charge. It was, however, checked and thrown back by French musketry. It was then that a cloud of dragoons under Kellermann threatened the 2 battalions now being directed by Brunswick himself, who attempted to withdraw in square formation. It was nigh impossible to execute the maneuvers under threat of cavalry and a fierce cannonade. Here, Brunswick was killed while rallying his men. French artillery continued to do its work. To the east of the high road, the Brunswick Hussars watched anxiously as 4 regiments of cavalry threatened both of their flanks. Trying to charge on their right, the cannonade was more than enough to send them flying to the rear. Seeing this, the French dragoons charged the fleeing enemy, leading them straight into the 92nd Highlanders, who deployed their grenadiers at a right angle to check the charge. The volley, uniform but not deadly, was once again enough to slow the momentum. But the threat was not yet thwarted. The columns of the 3rd Regiment of the Line appeared only 300 paces from the crossroads. Wellington, who had ridden up to Lieutenant Colonel James Cameron, gave the word. "Now, Cameron, is your time. Take care of that road." In moments, Cameron's Highlanders were given a deadly volley, but they pressed on and drove the enemy beyond the crossroads. During the action, Cameron was hit in the groin as his men attacked. The wounding of their respected commander put the Scots in a fury as they drove away the French infantry. It was only because of artillery fire that the Highlanders eventually sought shelter in the Bossu woods. Soon, some officers spotted French lancers threatening their position, but most dismissed them as Belgian cavalry. The Highlanders also saw the cavalry approaching. Their officers believed that they were indeed friendly cavalry, but veterans among the ranks doubted this, and knew that they were Frenchmen of the 6th Lancers. And the officers' doubts were quelled when a German dragoon rode by shouting, "Frenchy! Frenchy!" There was no time to receive the attack in square formation. The Lancers tore the 42nd, especially, to shreds, and everyone fought desperately for himself. Sir Brevet Marcara, the 42nd's commander, had to be carried to the rear, but Lancers quickly rode down his carriers. At the same time, the 5th Lancers closed in on the 44th Regiment of Foot. This time, the British were far better prepared and drove the Lancers away with a smart volley. The remnants of the 5th Division, depleted in manpower and ammunition, completed their withdrawal to the heights. 3rd Division, under Count Karl von Alten, began arriving on the battlefield after a full day's march, bringing the Allies to about 27,000 men. Most of the troops were deployed in the grass field adjacent to the Bossu woods, excepting the 69th Foot. The Hanoverians, along with the 95th Foot, advanced rapidly toward Pierremont, nearly capturing a French battery. The assault was ferocious, but was eventually checked by the 61st Line Regiment. The repulse had little effect. The French hold on the center was nonetheless weakened. However, d'Erlon had received a different order from the Emperor: march to Saint-Bref and help defeat the Prussians. Wishing to obey his Emperor, d'Erlon notified Ney that he would listen to the Emperor first. Worse yet, Napoleon, thinking that Quatre was already captured, expected Ney to reinforce him, but that order was delivered shortly after 5 p.m., the same time he penned for the First Corps to come to his aid. It was time for Ney to turn to some of his last reserves: François-Étienne de Kellermann's heavy cavalry. Ney wanted him to launch a determined charge in the crossroads and rout the battered Allied infantry. "My dear General, we must save France. We need an extraordinary effort. Tank your cavalry. Throw yourself into the middle of the English army. Crush it. Trample it underfoot." Kellermann was hesitant, but recognized the desperation of the battle nonetheless. He mounted his horse and joined his 800 cuirassiers in person. During the advance, Kellermann spotted the 69th Foot, for whatever reason, changing from square formation into line. The 11th Cuirassiers charged the 30th and 73rd Regiments of Foot. The 30th withstood the attack, but the 73rd Regiment panicked and fled into the Bossu woods when the armored horsemen made their appearance. On the opposite side of the road, the 69th desperately tried to close a new square, but the 8th Cuirassiers infiltrated it, slaughtering many of the soldiers. The regiment's color-bearer, George Annesley, received wounds but kept the flag under him. The king's color-bearer, however, was trampled to death, the flag ripped away by a cuirassier. The cuirassiers had sown terror into the Allied line, continuing their charge into the other regiments, which formed into proper squares. Kellermann redirected his forces to attack the Hanoverian battalions, but a devastating volley threw back his isolated cuirassiers. Kellermann's horse was shot from beneath him, and he fell back to the rear on foot with the survivors. After the charge, the 1st Brigade under Peregrine Maitland, part of Major General George Cooke's 1st Division, arrived with 2 battalions of the 1st Footguards. They were directed to attack the enemy in the Bossu woods. Prince Bernhard's troops watched as the Footguards finally drove the 1st Light Infantry from their vicinity, but also when French artillery once again crashed into British ranks, prompting a withdrawal into the woods once again, though this time they held it. Soon enough, the 2nd Brigade arrived, bringing with them the renowned 3rd Footguards and the Coldstream Guards. With the arrival of the 1st Division, Wellington felt that he had a superior enough force to attack his enemy, and so the contest of the center would truly begin. The 2nd and 3rd Brunswick battalions slowly drove back the French, until Ney attacked again with some of his cavalry. The Brunswickers formed a square in just the right amount of time, throwing back any charge. Jamin's brigade, however, stemmed their attack with accurate fire. Picton once again advanced his battered division. Surveying the battlefield, his horse was struck by round shot and collapsed on top of him. He was nearly saved by one of his aides. Picton was trying to survey the movements of Count Piret's cavalry, which were once again preparing for a charge, although they were spent by the day's fighting. Hubert's brigade of chasseurs à cheval launched themselves at the 1st and 28th Foot, now formed into a square where Picton was sheltered. Encouraging his men to hold on, Picton bellowed, "28, remember Egypt," in reference to past service. The conduct of his men must have made him proud, for 2 sharp salvos finally drove the chasseurs away for good. The day was growing old, and as the battle intensified, Wellington received a plea for reinforcements to the Prussians at Sombref, engaged in a battle with the Emperor himself. Feeling that he had the edge over Ney, Wellington ordered a counterattack to drive the enemy and march on Sombref. And so the counterattack began, all along the line. The Allies seized the initiative, slowly pushing back the exhausted and now outnumbered enemy. The last action of the day occurred when the first Footguards poured into the cornfield between the Bossu and the high road. Here, the 1st Light Infantry reformed and delivered a great salvo. Count Pire observed the encounter and sent his brigade of Lancers, Kellermann's Dragoons, and the Red Lancers of the Imperial Guard to the fray. The horsemen inflicted further severe casualties until the survivors took refuge in the edge of the woods, where the Brunswick avant-garde came to the rescue and dispersed the cavalrymen. This relatively local encounter threatened to stop the advance, but Wellington's forces were too great in number to withstand. Exhaustion on both sides began to tell, and finally, the French discontinued the contest completely and withdrew from Gemiancourt. The Battle of Quatre was over. As Ney's forces retired to Frame, the bulk of the Allied army remained among the no-man's land filled with the dead or wounded. Ney praised the conduct of his soldiers, but held untold anger against the orders that took First Corps away, snatching stalemate from the jaws of victory. Comte d'Erlon would arrive only at 9 p.m., relieving the exhausted Second Corps with 2 of his divisions. On the Allied side, the scale of events that day shocked the public, especially in Brussels, as wounded men wandered its streets. While the French had abandoned the field, casualties on either side were nearly equal. Darkness and exhaustion made marching to Blucher impossible. However, because the French could not take the crossroads, the way to Brussels was blocked, and Napoleon's advance faltered. Wellington planned to join the Prussians the next morning and renew the fighting with his reinforcements. But there was one problem. The battle around Sombref did not end well for the Prussians. A courier, delivering the news to Wellington, was shot by a French patrol. The Duke and his staff were unaware of the situation that befell their allies, one that would soon catch up to them.